Professor Worgley's here. We got this Angular app to work with just ng model, which is basically like a two-way data binding, more like a template driven form. You'll see that's an example here. There's a few ways to do template driven forms. Sometimes you do ng model. Sometimes you'll see some tutorials. They'll do like a little hashtag here, little hashtag for to do. And we can grab that element on the form. So I want to show you a few ways to do forms, and then we're going to wrap up by showing you the proper way, which is going to be a reactive form. So right now we have ng model, and you saw how the data binding, two-way data binding works. So let's go ahead and try just a regular template-driven form in a different way. Okay, so right now we're using ng model. We didn't have to use ng model. We could have also added a hashtag, and we can grab the values, which actually feels a little bit similar to how JavaScript would work by putting an ID and saying get element by ID. So let's say I get rid of this ng model. And it doesn't really matter where you put this hashtag, but you normally see it here at the front. Sometimes people put it at the back. So let's say I do hashtag to do. This is basically like putting an ID on this input and then getting element by ID. So here I have this ID to do. And now whenever I do a click, I can now grab this input element. So here I would have to actually pass something. By putting that little hashtag there, that means I can grab it by ID. So I can say to do here. And then I can do dot value. It's basically grab this input and grab the value of the input. So I could do that, pass it as a parameter. If I come back here, I can get rid of this global variable. And then on the add to do, I can pass over the to do, which is going to be a string. And I'd get rid of this keyword. Now this should work just the same as before. And it's also a template driven form. So if I come back to the compiled code, you see it compiles successfully. And if I do it this way, I actually don't need a forms module because I'm not using two-way data binding. So I actually don't need forms module. See, if I take that out, it still compiles. And if I come back to the code, I can still add elements here. So if I do test, test2, hit enter there, so it refresh, test, test2, you'll see it works just the same. Now that's a template driven form without using two-way data binding. They also have one-way data binding. So that's just placing an ID on the form. That way I can grab the form's value later on. But let's say I wanted to, instead of two-way data binding, I wanted to use one-way data binding. I can do that as well. So what I could do is keep the ID. Instead of using the two-way directive for ng model, we can also just use the keyword ng model. So I just do ng model. It's going to be one-way data binding. When I do this, I'll probably need to add that import back. And now what I can do on the form is I can do another hashtag here, so I can actually grab the form. I can call this my to-do form, which is going to be an ng form. And I can add another function. Let's see, ng submit. Whenever they submit the form, I'm going to call this corresponding function. So let's say I call to do submit, and I pass over the to do forms value. We'll see this is a little bit different than passing over the actual input elements value. So I specified model here for one-way data binding. And then if I come back to the code, you'll see to do submit cannot be applied. And if I search this error, I'm going to need to add this import back. So if I add the import back, it compiles successfully, but now it can't find this function. So I come back and create another function to do submit. Let's say it takes a form. And for now, we'll make it easy. We'll just say it takes any form. And I'm not sure if we need to specify a type. I think that's the default type. Looks like we do. Let's specify the any keyword. I don't recommend specifying any, but sometimes just to get it up and going quickly, you can. And we can print it out. So the first thing is to always print it out. So we can do a dir with the form. Now, how do we submit the form? Okay, the submit, what's nice about on submit is we can actually now hit the enter key. So I come back to the code and run it. Here I could do test and hit add. Now I can do test 2 and hit enter, and it submits the form. You'll see it's an object, and it's basically a JSON object because I could have many form elements. So I can have, let's say, to do name, to do date, and corresponding values. So if I hit enter, I get an object. So in here, I can check. First, is the form not equal to an empty string? Is it not equal to null? If it's not equal to null, I've already printed it out. You've seen it. And I can say this to do array. I need to push it a little bit differently. I need to push the forms to do element. Because if I come back to the code and do test, hit enter, am I still printing out the object? Oh, I hit the plus button. Let me hit enter. You'll see it's an object. If I open it up, the key is to do, the value is test. So I grab it by the key. Now I can do a print. Otherwise, alert, to do field required. Okay, so this works. I could send the value over just like I did here. On submit, I can call add to do and grab the to do value. That would also work. So if I come over here, do test, click add, test 2, hit enter, you'll see it does add successfully. If I delete, this also works. Okay, but this is not the proper way. These are all template-driven forms. Now with template-driven forms, we're going to use the form module. With reactive forms, we're going to use the reactive forms module. So I'm going to get rid of this. We still may need it for the ng submit. We'll see about that here in a little bit, but let's implement this correctly. This is all template-driven forms, and that's not what we want. So if I come back over here to the docs, we want to use reactive forms. You see I have a form control or a form group. In our example, we're going to use a form group even though we only have one element. So if you have one element, you could do a form control. Look how it instantiates the form control class. What's cool about this is I can have validators. So instead of checking if it equals empty string, display an error, you can actually say, don't allow it to submit unless there's a value there. And you could use regular expressions. So you can say, look for string, look for a number, and other powerful things, which you cannot do as easily with template-driven forms. So we're going to set up a reactive form. If I had one input, I could just do form control and that's it. But I'm going to use what's called a form group. It's a little bit more technical, but then you can have more user inputs, which you'll need for later challenges. So if I come back, let's set up a reactive form. So with the reactive form, I'm going to come back here. I got rid of that hashtag. Okay, so I got rid of this hashtag. This is Angular. This is Angular. Rest of it's just regular HTML. Here's Angular. Here's Angular. The click is Angular. The rest is HTML. Here's a little bit of Angular here. So I'm going to get rid of this. And we're going to use a reactive form. So I'm going to do form group. And then we're going to give it a name. So we're going to call it the to-do form. And now we don't need this hashtag anymore. You don't want to mix the two. Either use a template form with ng model 2-way or 1-way with the hashtag, or you don't use that and you use the reactive form. Don't use both. You got to choose one or the other. Now, what's cool about this is once I'm done, I don't need to be passing values like this anymore. It's going to be actually in the back end. So I don't need to pass the values. I won't be able to access them anyway. And I need to add a reactive forms input. So remember how I showed you to do the import earlier? Sometimes VS Code will add the import for you automatically. So reactive forms module is common, and it was able to find it. So I just typed it here and it added the import for me, which is awesome. That's why I love VS Code. Now it doesn't find this to do, and the methods are different now. I don't need the parameters. So I come back to my component.typescript. I can get rid of these parameters. We're not going to be passing forms around now. We can actually just grab the form directly. So I get rid of this. The code will almost compile. I need to build it. So instead of having an ng model like we did before, I'm going to take that out and I'm going to build a form builder or a form group. And you'll see here, if I come back, if you look at reactive forms, they have a bunch of different ways here. So you see basic control, I could just add one. You'll see form control, I can just add one. You can see I can set the value or get the value. They also have form group. So you can have a group of elements, first name and last name. And then the last name, which is the most powerful and the easiest to use. See, I have to use the new keyword on all of these if I have a bunch of elements. And you can see I can do nested. It's basically JSON. I have a profile form, which is a form group. Then I have a form control for first name, last name. Address is another group with street, city, state, and zip. But if I wanted to make this a little bit easier, I could use a form builder. You'll see I need to add an import. And then I have, it's basically a group. It's the same thing. First name is a string, last name is a string, address is another group, street is a string, city, state, zip. But it's a little bit of a shorthand. You don't have to use a new keyword, and it's just a little bit easier to use. So I do recommend coming and reading this reactive forms page. Otherwise, it'll be hard to understand what I'm doing here. So first, we need a constructor. If you're importing code inside of your individual component, you normally will do that in the constructor. Remember Java? We had constructors. So I'm going to do private. Sometimes you need to do public if you use it in several places. And I'm going to use the form builder. Notice how it knows what form builder is, so it actually added the import for me. That's awesome. If it doesn't know, what you can do, or what I like to do, is if I do import, sometimes you can do this here. If I do form builder, you may be able to find it and it may add it for you. But if it doesn't, I'll do an empty block here. Go over here and do the from. You can say add Angular forms. Once you have this import, you can just type F form builder, pops up automatically. So that's what I'll tend to do. I'll leave it empty, especially if VS Code doesn't know what import I want to do. Add the block, and then you're good to go. A lot of times there will be no code in the constructor, just adding the import here so I could use it in the code. I would say that's the only weird thing about Angular, is if I want to use this import here, I'm basically adding it as a parameter, which creates an instance of form builder, and then I could use form builder up here. So instead of my ng model, I can say, we're going to call it to do form, which is equal this.fb.group, just like the documentation, which is a JSON object. So I'm going to do the JSON notation here. And then I only have one, which is going to be to do, which is going to be a string. If I had another, I could keep going and add in more, but this one's just going to have one. Now, what's cool about this is I can add validators, and it talks about adding validators here later. So you see validators required. First name is required. Earlier, I could do it, but it'd be a little bit more difficult. So here I can say validators dot required. It doesn't know what this is, so I need to add the import. If I come back over here, you'll see validators is from forms. So I could add another import like this. So if I copy it, I could do another import like this, but I already have Angular Forms here. So I can actually just do a comma and add validators here and then get rid of this one. So you can group your imports together. Now this works, so it's going to be required. And this form will not be submitted unless they type a to do. You will still want to keep your if, make sure it's not empty in the backend code in the controller, but it's nice that the front end checks it too. Now remember, having this in the parameter of the constructor creates an instance of form builder. That way I can use it throughout the program. Normally with Java, you'd create the instance yourself. So you say form builder equals new form builder. This is just the way Angular does it. And that's the one thing that took me a little bit of time to get used to. But once you know how it works, then you should have no problem. So now whenever I add the to-do, I can grab it from the form, because whenever they add it, we got to know that the value's done already. Just like when we did two-way data binding with the model. So I can say let value equal this dot to-do form. Now to-do form is a JSON, so I'm going to grab the value of it, and then I can grab the to-do element. So this is how it's going to work. So you see it's a little bit of a JSON there, and then I'm going to check the value here. And then I'm going to use value instead of to do. I could do this and push it all over, but it's a little bit nicer to just create a local variable and use it. Now that I'm using a reactive form, I technically don't need this to do submit. Otherwise, it's going to be the same thing. So I can take this out. And I'm just going to add to do on both of them. So I'll take out this to do submit and add to do. So you see the code's much cleaner now, and it has a validator. So it's actually going to check it for me, which is nice. Now, one thing here in the HTML, I have a name here, which if I'm sending up to the server will work, but I also need to combine that with the form group. So I need to put form control name here and let Angular know this is my to-do element. So this to-do needs to match the one that's specified in this form group. So if I had another one, let's say first name, last name, then I'd have several form control names, first name, last name. Okay, so this is a reactive form. So you've seen all the different ways. I can do ng model two-way data binding, ng model one-way data binding. I could use the hashtag and create like an ID. I can create a hashtag to create an ID for the form. I can pass the individual value. I can pass the entire form. You saw both ways. Now we're using reactive forms. Now the code's nice and clean. It compiles successfully. You'll see we didn't need the other form anymore. We're just using reactive forms. Now, if I come back to the page, you'll see if I add test, click the add button, it works. If I do test 2 and hit enter, it also works. Test 3, hit enter. Now, if I delete, deletes in the middle, deletes at the beginning, deletes at the end. Okay, so the delete is working as well. But notice how this value stays here. Normally, when you add, you want to reset this. Now that it's a reactive form, I can do it easily. I could have also done it with the two-way data binding. So for example, in the TypeScript file, after I add it to the array, I could have said to do equals empty string and set it back to its original value. With the reactive forms, they actually have a reset method. So once I push it to the array, I can say this dot to do form, and and then they have a reset. They have a reset function. Okay, so now if I run this, if I do test, click add, it resets. Test 2, hit enter, it also resets. So that's nice. That's a good UI experience. You'll see the cursor changes when I click an icon, so they know it's clickable. That's also a good user experience. Okay, so now we've successfully used Reactive Forms. Let's go ahead and do a Git push. I probably should have made another branch for this, for the Reactive Forms. Okay, we're on the master branch. So I'm going to do a Git checkout -b Reactive Forms. Git status. So I'm going to push all this. Git commit -a-m looked at template versus Reactive Forms. Switched to proper way, which is Reactive Forms. Do a Git status. Now I'm on the Reactive Forms branch, so I'll switch to the dev branch and I'll merge this. Make sure you spell it correctly. And then I could switch to master and also merge dev. Okay, and that's how you should do it. So create a branch for each feature, merge them back up to dev. Once dev is working after you merge all the feature branches, then merge it up to master. Okay, we're going to add animations, make this look even better. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.